attention, if you didn't see me wrestling with this big thing a minute ago, and this, I guess, is now a part of our church library, but this is a copy of the Codex Sinaiticus. We talked about Tischendorf a couple weeks ago, and the work he did at St. Catherine's in North Africa, in Egypt. This is actually I'll try to show you. Oh my goodness. It's actually photographed copies of all the leaves of that codex. The most complete and oldest manuscripts of the Bible that we have. And if you look through here, you'll even see some of the pages where all they had were the fragments to photograph. And yes, and that's what Tischendorf had to work with, that he found and recovered and over all those years and 3 trips to Egypt. Some of those pages have stamps on the bottom of them, property of the University of Leipzig, which is where the majority of that, or portions of that codex reside. And he had bits and pieces and copying it by hand. Just tremendous work. That's really cool to look through. So if you get a chance, when we're done, come up here and leaf through it. Or you have to go to the, British Museum. You can look through it there too. What's that? Go there. Yeah, just go make a trip over there. You can look at it in real life. All right, week number 8 on how we got the Bible. I want to, if I can find it, I was going to read to you a quote. This is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his book, The Gulag Archipelago. I don't know if any of you have ever read that. Very, very good book. And he's talking about the gulags in the Soviet Union and the political prisoners that were sent to these labor camps and what it was that allowed people to accept this sort of treatment of humanity. So he writes in chapter 4 of the Gulag Archipelago, Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb. The imagination and spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes. That is how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills by invoking Christianity, the conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, the Jacobins by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. Ideology is indeed what gives evil its justification. And that was true with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, a note here. These last few weeks we've talked a lot about Roman Catholicism and some of the negative activities that went on. We're going to talk a little more today about some of the corruption and the political and religious evil that was done. I want to say this. Pretty much every person I've ever met that was a member of the Roman Catholic Church has been a good and decent, God-fearing person. Every priest we're going to talk about the priesthood today a little bit, and it was a mess, but every priest I've ever met, I believe to be a good, godly man. So I am not trying to paint with too broad of a brush about Catholicism, and I just want to be clear on that. I'm a white guy. I know you couldn't tell, but I am. I've never owned slaves. Nobody in my family, to my knowledge, my family history, ever owned slaves. But I do recognize that as an American, as a white American, I am in a country that has a history that is very ugly with regard to that issue. And while I personally have not been complicit in that activity, I do understand that it's part of the story of our country, and I have to bear a certain level of responsibility in knowing that and how I move forward. I am part of that story even though I did not participate in it. There are many, many good, God-fearing, wonderful people in the Catholic Church. And a lot of good work has been done by the Catholic Church. But the wrong that was done in its name is a part of the history. And so we do have to talk about that story. So I just want to be clear on that we can be good people, but we can belong to stories that contain evil. And every religious group can be made up of good people that belong to stories of evil. So we have to be honest about it in how we deal with it. Where we are in our story, for 1,000 years, the Catholic Church was the church. It was all there was. There were other groups in other places, but for the most part, the reach and the power of the Roman Empire and of the Roman Catholic Church was worldwide. And the scriptures were completely locked down in Latin 1,000 years. There was no other way to digest those words. Even as the Latin language fell out of use, even as the Roman Empire collapsed over the course of that millennia. They outlawed the private ownership of Scripture. They outlawed free preaching. What is free preaching? Well, that is preaching by someone who is not authorized by the church to be doing so. That was not allowed. You had to be licensed, you had to be ordained, and as I said last week, the priesthood was a means of wealth, power, and prestige and privilege. And there were many atheists in the priesthood. There were many priests that were illiterate, but they were there to disseminate the word of God in Latin to the people, who also, by the way, were illiterate, particularly when it came to Latin. So everybody was kind of in the dark. Now you can imagine the problems that arise when you have a priesthood that's based on power and money and political office, and not on the spiritual well-being and shepherding of Christians. Corruption became a major problem. As the Roman Empire fell, the Roman Catholic Church replaced it as a global political power. The Roman Empire fell. There was, and we'll talk about this a little bit today, still something called the Holy Roman Empire. Have you ever heard of that? And it's primarily Germanic. It's Eastern European. But it sort of took up the mantle of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, in some ways, still exists in the form of the Roman Catholic Church, because its power and its influence and its scope are similarly wide in its control. Not as much now as it used to be, but during this 1,000 years, as the political power and the military power of the Roman Empire descended, the Roman Catholic Church's power ascended. The Holy Roman Empire, by the way, funnily enough, it's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not an empire, but they called it that nonetheless. And there have been many who have sought to maintain that. The Holy Roman Empire believed itself to be the next incarnation of the original Roman Empire. Hitler believed his empire would be the next incarnation of that. And so that's been a recurring theme in history, is trying to bring back the Roman Empire. So the Latin language was gone, the priesthood was corrupted. Now, things happen in history, and when we talk about these things, a lot of things are even happening at the same time and overlapping. It brings us to a guy named John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe lived in the middle portion of the 1300s. He lived during the time of the Great Plague. The Great Plague it wiped out 70% of the population. I mean, it just decimated, more than decimated, the world's population. Now, John Wycliffe survived the plague. He's teaching at Oxford, in Balliol College, is where John Wycliffe taught. Of the classics, of the classical fields of study, one of the highest fields of study you could achieve expertise in was theology at this time. Theology was a major field of study, and John Wycliffe studied theology. He was a Christian. But during the plague, he began to become curious as to why God or how God was moving in this ordeal. He was seeking God's purpose through this terrible global crisis of this plague. And so he starts reading the scriptures. And he started getting angry because he was discovering things he did not know about, that he had not been aware of. He started going back to the Greek and reading the Greek and realizing how corrupt the Bible had become in its Latin form and as the Catholic Church taught it. So as he's becoming more and more and more angry, he starts discovering just how many problems exist in the Catholic Church and in the priesthood. Well, he has a platform at Oxford, obviously, as a teacher in Balliol College, and he begins teaching his students about this corruption and teaching for reform, publicly speaking out for reform of the priesthood. He spoke out against the doctrine of transubstantiation. Does everybody know what transubstantiation is? That's the belief that the bread and the cup, literally, when they're blessed, they become the body and the blood of Christ. Literally. So that you are actually partaking of the body and partaking of the blood. And therefore, it is too sacred for you to get your dirty common hands on. The priest needs to bless it and give it to you. It was another means of elevating the priesthood and lowering the common person. And he spoke out against that. So he's doing this. Well, of course, the Catholic Church is none too happy about him speaking out like this. But he's way up there at Oxford. And just as the world's population had been decimated, the power of the Catholic Church had been decimated by the plague. 70% of their bishops and cardinals and priests were gone too. And so their power and their reach was limited. So Wycliffe was able to continue teaching and continue working. And he began making copies of those Greek manuscripts into English, or into early forms of English, and into a form that people could read. So he starts doing this work. Now, he had some protection, both because of the weakness of the power of the Catholic Church and because he was at Oxford. Okay, the king wanted to protect him. There was the idea of academic freedom. They were trying to protect Wycliffe, but eventually the pressure put upon the university and upon England by the church was too much, and he had to flee. He goes to a place called Lutterworth, and he's developed quite a following amongst his students because he would copy and he would write, and because you had to do it quickly. And it took there was no printing press yet. We're a little ways away from that. And so he's copying things by hand and giving them to students and saying, go, take it somewhere, and spread it and recopy it. And he would continue doing this, and he was filling the world with the words of Scripture in languages that people could read and understand. The church developed a term for those that followed Wycliffe or agreed with his teachings. They were known as the Lollards. Lollard is kind of an old English word for stupid, dumb. Yeah, Mike?
Mumblers or a mutterer?
There you go, mumblers and mutterers. You know, this is a very common practice when people are engaged in political debates. When you run out of points to make, you just start calling names, right? And that happens on both sides, okay? 2016, Hillary Clinton made an offhanded remark about Donald Trump supporters being deplorables. And Trump supporters actually began wearing T-shirts that said, I'm a deplorable. You know, they took up the word and they turned it around on him and used it as a source of pride. Same thing happened with the Lollards. They kind of took up that name as a badge of honor and identified as Lollards, stupid, because you would be stupid to question the authority of the Catholic Church. That was the idea. So, Wycliffe gave us some of the first non-Latin,
I was reading von Tischendorf
memoirs, basically.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said, he attributes it to someone, he didn't know who, but was a saying when he went to school that said, when history speaks, philosophers should fall silent. And that's what Wycliffe's doing, saying, wait a minute, history speaks here. If it's different from what you said, you have to be the one that's wrong.
Yeah, next week we're going to talk about, oh no, I lost the name. We're going to talk about a guy next week who used a very similar phrase. He was reading through the scriptures and discovering some of the same things Wycliffe discovered. And he said, either I am wrong or the scriptures are not what they say. The scriptures we have. Yeah, Mike?
I'll go as fast as I can. A little thing that the Catholic Encyclopedia has on Wycliffe.
Let's hear it.
All right. It doesn't say his name. It says Wycliffeites.
Yes. Yeah.
The followers of John Wycliffe, parish priest of Lutterworth, Leicestershire. His chief doctrines were that dominion, spiritual and temporal authority, is founded in grace, Eucharistic combination, that the substance of bread remains in the Eucharist. I like the way they explain that. The sufficiency of the scriptures as a rule of life, the importance of preaching over Mass and the sacraments, and that the Holy See, S-E-E, has no primary of jurisdiction.
Yeah.
I don't have a definition for Holy See.
The
He was
Pope.
condemned by local synods in England and posthumously by the Council of Constance. Lauderdale, as a general form of religious dissent, persisted until the Reformation, but its real influence was through the Hussites of Bohemia, who adopted its errors.
It's errors, right.
Errors.
Ah, well, you've given a nice little preview as to who's coming next in our story. But I'll talk a little bit about those contributions that Wycliffe made. His work led to a proliferation of biblical translation work that began in his time and continued well after into the Protestant Reformation. He wrote several books, particularly one of his most famous is about the church and about what the church should look like. And he did object to the divine reception of the papacy. You know, the Roman Catholic Church believes the Pope is the vicar of Christ. It's Christ on earth. And his words have the authority of Christ. Wycliffe objected to that. And his followers objected to that.
But then he's infallible.
Yeah, exactly. He spoke out, Wycliffe did, on political reforms and religious reforms. That the tying up of politics and religion, the power of the state and the power of the church was a bad thing. He used in his writings a phrase that we have in our founding documents, that a government should be of the people, by the people, and for the people. You've heard that before. Our founding fathers stated that in this country. That is a direct quote from John Wycliffe. The concepts of liberty and the democratization of government went hand in hand for him with the deinstitutionalization of the church. And I want to point out, both he and many of the first generation of followers after him were not interested in not being Catholic. They weren't wanting to leave the church. They didn't want to tear down the church. They wanted to fix the church. It really isn't until we get to Martin Luther where we start seeing attitudes of saying, okay, we got to be done with this. We're doing our own thing. But Wycliffe planted these seeds that would continue beyond him. He was declared an enemy of the church, a heretic. That is a death sentence. The power of the Catholic Church did extend to the sword. They had their own armies that they raised up. They had their own spies. They had tattletales in every community and town that would let them know when there was someone doing things that were not in keeping with their tenets and their doctrines. But again, the church was not strong enough to get to him, to act on that. And Wycliffe died of natural causes New Year's Eve of 1384. However, as Wycliffe's teachings influenced others, and we'll talk about John Huss here in just a minute that Mike mentioned, the church when they were strong enough again, and they had the reach, and now they were dealing with a much louder call for reform from Bohemia, they said, we're going to put an end to this. And they tried John Wycliffe posthumously for heresy. Convicted him, dug up his bones, burned them, and scattered his ashes.
That'll show.
Yeah, right? That's how serious they were about shutting this guy up. Bob?
I was going to say, I think it speaks a lot to some of these early reformers that they truly were not trying to, I mean, you said this, they weren't trying to leave the church, and it's because they believed in the sanctity of Big C Church.
Yeah.
And they thought that that's what this was, and they were trying to keep that together, and I think that shows a lot about who they are as people versus who they were combating against.
Right.
Not to say that the ones that did split, obviously they are a huge part of history, that's did the right step as well, but it does speak to these guys' faithfulness and what they were trying to do was impressive.
And
to try to still be a part of an organization that hates you is impressive.
yeah, and changing the culture of something from within is always difficult.
Yeah.
I think it all also has to do with the fact that this was the only church that anyone knew, because it had been around for 1,000 years at this point. And they could trace a direct lineage, so to speak, to the church in the book of Acts. And the way that, what I mean by that is, it wasn't like you had this, the church was just out there functioning just the way God designed it, and everything was going great, and then all of a sudden the Catholic Church came into existence and shut everything else out. It wasn't really like that. These churches, these local congregations, they met in the synagogues. They many of them Jewish at first, then later Gentiles, and they began organizing themselves. And they appointed elders, just as Paul recommended to do. Well, you've all probably been a part of a church. I don't think this one, but maybe elsewhere, where you had an eldership, but there was kind of a head elder, right? You've been a part of churches, even organizations. People are appointed as a part of leadership, but one kind of rises to the top, and he kind of holds the veto power over the rest, kind of the head elder. Well, that happened in the early church too. They would select these leaders, and then one of them was kind of the wisest among, the leader amongst that leadership group. Well, eventually, then, those head people started talking to the other heads of other churches, and then they would get together and discuss matters. And amongst that group, then the discussion was, well, which one among us is in charge? And that sort of hierarchy began building organically. Constantine, when he established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, formalized that. And if you look at the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the Roman government, they mirror each other. You got an emperor and you got a pope. You got the Senate and you got the cardinals. And you've got your local governors, and you've got your bishops. And so he was designing a church that looked like an empire on purpose. But it evolved into that. And so there is a direct lineage that people would have traced that said, hey, this Roman Catholic Church thing is not a bad idea, but we got to fix a few things. Hal and then Bob.
One of the things that at this time that you have to look at is the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yes.
And because that's the only thing that you saw different than the Roman Catholic Church. And actually the Eastern Orthodox Church kept some things very closely to the biblical example.
That's true. That's true. Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Church, there were other groups that existed out there. And that at different times, at different levels of strength. But and those divisions happened over different things over time as well. That's a good thing to point out. Bob?
I was going to say, along with what you were just talking about, with the fact that the Pope didn't happen overnight, it started with a good thought. Like, let's have a person over these people so we can have more togetherness. Everything that we look at as how dare the Methodist Church do that, how dare this church do that, all of those things started as well, this had to happen for this specific reason, and then we just loosened it a little bit, loosened it a little bit, loosened it a little bit, and here we are 500 years later, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the way everything's done. No.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what
Once
reform
you
is reminding people, hey, let's get back to what we were 500 years ago. Let's get what we were 60 years ago, whatever. So.
Once you start making rules, you have to make more rules to enforce those rules. That's how it happens. I grew up in a fairly conservative, because there were others that were more so, but fairly conservative Church of Christ in Arkansas. Bible Belt, okay, kind of gives you an idea. We had a rule. We don't believe in instrumental music in worship. Okay, that's fine. We can all agree on that rule. Well, now wait a minute. What if somebody wants to use our building for a wedding and they bring in a piano? Well, it's not a worship service, but what if somebody forgets to move the piano on Saturday and Sunday everybody comes in and you know, little Norma Jean is sitting back there clutching her pearls because there's a piano up there, and everybody, the rumor's going to start that the church here is embracing instrumental music. Okay, so no instrumental music at weddings. You know, no instrumental music. What about playing? Well, that's a slippery slope, so we're not going to even play instrumental music in our service. Youth group trips. We'd all get on the bus, and we'd be going, well, we want to turn the radio on? Nope. What if we listen to Christian music? Okay. Well, that Christian band, they use instruments, right? That's kind of blurring the line. Only a cappella worship music on the church bus. See, we had all these rules. Now, all fine rules if that's how you feel, you know, if you feel strongly about that, but you do have to acknowledge you did not get those rules from the Bible. You made some of those rules. With good intentions, fine, but just know where the rules come from. They're not all coming from book, chapter, verse, okay? But that was a good point, Bob. Those things start happening, build organically, and we lose sight of where they came from. Yeah, Mike?
But you could listen to Def Leppard,
Well, I did.
Black Sabbath, you know, all those other.
When you go home, yeah, listen to
Yeah,
whatever.
go ahead and turn that up on the old bus.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit. See, I was more of a Blood, Sweat, and Tears guy. If anybody's old enough to remember Blood, Sweat, and Tears from the late 60s, that was more my speed. All right, John Huss. John Huss was from Bohemia. Modern-day Czech Republic. Okay, he's in Prague. It was Czechoslovakia, it was Bohemia. Okay, you get it. So he's in Bohemia. He never wrote a Rhapsody as far as I know. But now he lived... his early life kind of contemporary to the later life of John Wycliffe, but he never knew John Wycliffe. Never had any idea who he was, never even heard of him until he is teaching at the University of Prague, and one of his students begins bringing to him some stuff he's found, some writings by this guy Wycliffe. And it was stuff that he wrote and given to his students that got passed along, and it made its way all the way to the Czech Republic, to Prague, to Bohemia, and into the hands of John Huss. And he starts reading it, and he goes, wow, that's exactly how I feel. I've been having some of these same thoughts, but I couldn't put them into words, and John Wycliffe had done it. So John Huss discovers John Wycliffe while he's teaching in Prague. And so he too begins teaching for reform. It is important to know that John Huss is not, he's a reformer in his own right, okay? But he is, by all accounts, a disciple of Wycliffe, primarily. He is sold out for John Wycliffe. He is a fanboy of John Wycliffe, okay? So do keep that in mind a little bit, that this was an ideological thing for him, and he was a Wycliffeite, if there ever was one. And that's how a lot of reformers are, and how a lot of people who profess certain philosophies are. They've grabbed onto someone that they like and they agree with, and that's what they teach. So he very much promoted Wycliffe's teachings. He was a conduit for Wycliffe's teachings to another generation. he continued translating and distributing much of Wycliffe's work. He kept Wycliffe's work alive. Again, he is denounced by the Catholic Church. Eventually, he's declared a heretic. We'll get to that in a minute. And they sent an archbishop to attack him. Now, I don't mean physically attack him, but they sent an archbishop into Bohemia, into Prague, into the university to denounce him and to fight back. Now, you've really angered some people if they have assigned a special archbishop just to bring you down. And John Huss did that. He was very loud and determined, and he refused to back down. Absolutely refused to back down. We've got to talk a little politics here, because something important happened that impacted how all this story plays out. There was a papal schism. It's known as the Western Schism in the Catholic Church. It happened in 1378. So, by this point, since like 1306, somewhere in there, or 1309 maybe, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church had been in Avignon, in France. So the Pope was living in France for like 70 years. And I think that was Pope Gregory. Pope Gregory decides, I'm going to go back and visit Rome. Got some family there, and it's Easter, so I'm going to go back to Rome for a little while. So he goes back to Rome. Now, Rome is very upset that the Pope no longer lives there. Okay? It's kind of like, you get these senators and Congress people, and they get themselves a townhouse, in Georgetown, out in D.C., because that's where they work, right? And they're hardly ever back in their home district. And then someone decides to run against them in the next election, and they make a big point about it. They'll put ads out, so-and-so doesn't even live here anymore. They're in Washington all the time. They're out of touch with the voters of Illinois or whatever. Similar. People were pretty upset that the Pope wasn't living in, they're the Roman Catholic Church after all. And the Pope doesn't even live in Rome. So Gregory's there. He's only planning on staying a little while, but while he's there visiting, he died. So it's time to hold a papal election. So the cardinals get together and they say, well, these folks here in Rome are going to go berserk if we elect a pope that goes back to France. So we need to elect a pope that's going to stay here. We're going to need to elect their guy because that's who they want. So they elect Pope Urban. He was from the city. Pope Urban was elected, and almost immediately they regretted this. They thought it was a bad decision. So they get back together and they say, never mind, that's invalid. We're going to elect another pope. I'm trying to remember. Benedict. I think Benedict. There was a Benedict, and then there was a... there's a Benedict, and then there's another pope, Alexander, but that comes a little bit later. Anyway, we got two popes. There's two popes. One of them is in France, the other in Rome, Pope Urban and Pope Benedict. So what that means is the Roman Catholic Church is divided, and the political loyalties begin to be divided between two popes. Because remember, the power of the church lent power to the state, and the power of the state protected the power of the church. It was a symbiotic relationship. So, good King Wenceslaus. You've ever heard that name before? King Wenceslaus. He was real. He wasn't particularly good, even though we call him that. He did something pretty good. Wenceslaus he was in Bohemia. So he's the king of this area where John Huss is. He wants to be Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope has some ability to do that for him. So he's got to pick a horse that he's going to bet on. And he bets on Benedict in an effort to secure political appointment, essentially, as the king of the Holy Roman Empire. That divided the faculty and the students of the University of Prague, where John Huss was. And there was a walkout. It's like 90% of the faculty and the staff and the students at the University of Prague left because Wenceslaus had sided with the wrong pope, in their opinion. Now, here's the good part of that. It left John Huss as the most senior faculty member at the University of Prague. So all of a sudden, he has this pulpit, this platform, to preach for reform with the loudest possible voice. So Wenceslas's political maneuvering actually amplified the voice of John Huss. And he preached against indulgences. This was one of the big things that some of these reformers were against. In this papal schism, eventually there was a third pope. See, they got together, I think, in Pisa. They called a council together and said, we got to fix this pope situation. So we're going to name a new pope, and that's the end of it. And they named a new pope, Alexander, and no one cared. So now we had 3 popes. Alexander was called the anti-pope. The 5th, right. Don't know what happened to the first 4, but yeah. Well, these popes decide, or Benedict, I'm gonna go to war. I'm gonna fight the Catholic Church fought a lot of crusades going into Jerusalem and such. Well, they also fought crusades against themselves. There was a Catholic civil war. So Benedict says, I'm gonna raise an army. And how are you gonna pay for this? Well, we're gonna send out our sales force, the priesthood. The priests were the sales force of the Catholic Church. And one of the products they sold was prepaid sins. That's what indulgences were. If you had sinned, the only way to take care of that, well, first you had to go to confession. And by the way, what a great way, what a great tool for ensuring your political and religious power. Because, okay, I've sinned, so I got to go see Father so-and-so, and I know he's on the other side of that little screen, and he knows who I am. We live in the same town, but I got to tell him every bad thing I did this week. And he's like, okay, should we just start where you left off last time? And now here is someone who now knows every bad thing I've ever done, and I am directed by church order to do this. You got to give up all your secrets. Again, every priest I've ever known, I believe, holds this in the highest regard for privacy and keeping confidence, but it was an opportunity for corruption during this time where those secrets could be used to coerce and manipulate. And so you had to go to confession anyway and tell your sins. Well, now, what are you going to do about your sins? Well, you got to say a certain number of prayers. There was a prescription for getting rid of your sin. Or you could buy your way out of it. My youngest son, Jack, plays hockey in Monroe at the Monroe Youth Hockey Association. Now, hockey can be pretty expensive. The equipment and just the cost to maintain ice, for 6 months out of the year, it's expensive. So they charge, you want to sign up and play hockey, you got to pay something. In order to keep the costs low, one of the things the Hockey Association does is they assign you volunteer hours. Okay, so you got a kid that's this age, he's been playing this many years, here's how many hours you got to do. Because working a concession stand and, being the guardian of the penalty box during a game, that carries a certain monetary value with it that contributes to the organization. So you volunteer. We don't have to pay people to work the concession stand, and that's how we save money. So there's 2 options I had this year. I could work 25 volunteer hours. It's like community service. I could work 25 hours as a volunteer, or I could pay $625 to buy my way out of it. I worked the concession stand quite a bit. That's how indulgences work. You can buy your way out of this sin. Or, if you think you might commit a sin at some point in the near future, perhaps you might be interested in some of our prepayment plans. It's like a prepaid funeral, Some of our prepayment plans whereby you can commit a sin free of charge. Well, not free of charge on the front end, but you don't get punished on the back end, right? What a deal. Now, if you're a guy thinking about, I don't know, if you've got, let's say you're a guy, you've got that indulgence just burning a hole in your pocket, and, maybe your wife is griping at you about going bowling with your buddies tonight, and you're just thinking, that's not a healthy way to live. But it was a sales activity to fund crusades, to fund the papacy, and the efforts to achieve supreme power in the papacy because it's so fractured. So John Huss spent a lot of time preaching against that practice and the corruption in the priesthood. Now, the Catholic Church's response to all this was to come down hard on him and on Bohemia. They actually authorized essentially an economic sanction of Bohemia. The Pope said no business can be done with Bohemia. He issued a papal bull. That's what they called it, a papal bull. I just love the words they use. That just means an executive order. It's a papal executive order. You couldn't do business in Bohemia. No supplies coming in. Trying to devastate the economy and put pressure on the university and the pressure on Huss. So he preached against indulgences. He preached against the restrictions on free preaching because he didn't have a license. So they were after him for that too. The corruption of the priesthood and transubstantiation, much like John Wycliffe. John Huss contributed to future Western thought with his comments and writings on the separation of church and state. He believed that governments and churches should not be commingled together. That states having a church religion, a state religion, governments having a state religion, and churches having government ties was not good for either. So he very much picked up the ideas of John Wycliffe and carried them on. Eventually, the pressure starts to become too much, and of course Wenceslaus, with his desire for political advancement, can no longer protect John Huss, and Huss has to flee. But as he does, he continues preaching and continues writing and continues translating on the run. Wenceslaus had a brother, Sigismund. Sigismund was the king of Hungary. Well, he was actually eventually appointed. Can you imagine being Wenceslaus? All you want is to be the Holy Roman Emperor, and your brother gets it. I mean, your whole life he got to start on the football team. He was mom and dad's favorite, and now the king of Hungary, Sigismund, he's going to end up becoming Holy Roman Emperor. But he was going to help the church fix this problem because they despised what Huss was doing. He was causing so many problems in Eastern Europe, in Bohemia and beyond. These Hussites, these followers of Huss, who were really followers of Wycliffe, were a problem. So they're going to call together the Council of Constance, which is going to be a meeting that's going to take place at Constance, and they're going to get together. There was a lot of problems they were trying to work out, such as the Pope issue, but also they're going to deal with this Huss problem. And Huss says, that feels like a trap to me. They're asking me to come to this meeting where all the people that want to kill me are hanging out. And Sigismund says, I will protect you. You will be you'll be there as my guest, I will protect you. And for a time he was. And so they put John Huss there in the middle and they say, well, you need to recant all these things you've been teaching. And some of the stuff they presented, he hadn't actually taught. There were some trumped up charges that were levied against him. And he said, if there's anything, I'm not going to recant anything I haven't done. So he denied that he had participated in heresy by their definition, and he refused to recant the things that he did teach. Eventually, Sigismund could no longer protect him. He was arrested and imprisoned and was kept in a dungeon for weeks. He was suffering poor health, infection, starvation. He was weakened. They put him on trial. Again, it's a show trial. The outcome's already determined. He refuses to recant. And so the sentence is passed down that he'll be put to death. Stripped down, completely naked, tied to a stake. They put if you ever look, you can look up, I think it's a painting or a drawing. It's called, I think, The Burning of the Goose. I think is what it's called. The goose was a name they had given to Huss. Huss's name actually means the goose. John Huss. Huss means goose. And so they would call him the goose. By the way, that little insult has actually carried down into our vernacular. Oh, you're being a silly goose. Yeah. John Huss was the first silly goose. If you look up that picture, I'm pretty sure that's the one that shows him tied to the stake, and he's wearing this cone-shaped hat. The dunce hat that we used to see in caricatures of grade school. That originated with the Inquisition. They would put that hat on you to shame you, and to point out the stupidity of opposing their doctrines. So he's tied to the stake. They surround him with kindling and his writings and the writings of John Wycliffe. And they light fire to it. And John Huss was executed on July 6, 1415. And again, subsequent to that, 14 years after that, I guess, they dug up John Wycliffe and burned him too. Right? Just in case. But the influence of these men had a profound effect on what would come after it, and eventually the Protestant Reformation. When we talk about Reform and Reformation, the first name that comes to your mind is who? Luther. He was the reformer, the 95 Theses and all of that. But there was so much that happened before Martin Luther. Wycliffe and Huss. Thomas Linacre, who we'll talk about next week. Miles Coverdale. Johannes Gutenberg and the printing press. All of that is coming. And all of it comes at just the right time to continue this work of these two great men. Incidentally, Wycliffe and Chaucer, between Wycliffe and Chaucer, that is how we developed a standardized English language. English was kind of this new thing. It had not been standardized yet. But the writings of John Wycliffe and of Chaucer and of others, William Tyndale as well, helped to standardize our English language. The fact that we have agreed upon words and spellings of certain things has to do with the efforts to put the Bible into common language. So much of our own history is rooted in the efforts of people to give us the Scripture. I think that's a wonderful and really, really cool history. Any questions or thoughts or comments about any of this? Yeah.
Reading through and looking at Huss and Bohemia and everything else, this, I was looking for when this thing was printed. They actually called that area, it was full of, they're communists. They said it was a communistic type of structure in Bohemia. It's just like they're trying to diss it.
Yeah, I wonder if that was written during a time where that would have been quite an insult.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because communism is actually mentioned in a couple of places.
Yeah. And in fact, while Eastern Europe has had its share of history with regard to government organization and systems, the Bohemians and the Reformers were very much, and I don't want to label them with modern terms, but I mean, they were very much of the mind that the people should have a right to see after their own affairs. And the state should have a right to see after its own affairs. And the church should have nothing to do with either of them when it comes to governing their lives. The Reformers very much held that view at various degrees. By no means were all of the Reformers uniform in their beliefs, by the way. You will see differences between them. Martin Luther had some views that differed from Wycliffe and differed from Tyndale and differed from Linacre. Next week we talk about Thomas Linacre. He was, one of the highest order of scholars, and he was a physician. And his paths cross with a very important figure in European history that will lead to the opportunity for the proliferation of Reformed thought and eventually a major break from Catholicism in England. That's a little tease for you for next week. So you have to come back and hear how that is, to be continued. Really cool stuff. Yeah. Anything else?
This is a 1951 Bible, so.
Oh, right in the middle of
Right.
the Red Scare. Yeah.
They got bombs.
That's right. Anything else? All right. Well, I'll see you next week then.